I can't breathe anymore, Hyunjin. The words shattered the silence before the apartment door slammed shut. For a heartbeat, Hyunjin remained frozen, his fingers still wrapped around the ceramic mug he had been holding. The sound echoed through the quiet apartment like a gunshot, leaving behind an emptiness so loud that even the rain outside seemed to stop. Then the mug slipped from his hands. It struck the hardwood floor and exploded into white fragments. Only then did he run. Felix. His voice cracked as he pulled the front door open. Cold rain rushed into the hallway, soaking his shirt instantly. The elevator doors were already closing. Inside stood Felix. His face was pale. His suitcase rested beside him. His trembling fingers gripped the handle tightly enough for his knuckles to turn white. For one impossible second, their eyes met. Those familiar brown eyes, the ones that had always sparkled whenever Hyunjin smiled, looked strangely empty tonight. Not angry. Not hateful. Simply exhausted. The elevator doors slid shut. Hyunjin lunged forward, but his fingertips touched nothing except cold metal. No! He slammed his fist against the closing doors. The elevator descended. Floor 12, 11, 10, until the display no longer glowed. Silence returned. Only the rain remained. 3 months earlier, most people believed Felix and Hyunjin had the perfect relationship. They laughed louder than anyone, cooked together, fought over harmless things like which movie to watch, shared hoodies, shared playlists, shared dreams. People envied them because they looked effortless. But love rarely collapses all at once. Sometimes it disappears one unnoticed piece at a time. It began with silence. Hyunjin's career had entered the busiest season of his life. Endless rehearsals stretched into midnight. Photo shoots replaced weekends. Interviews consumed mornings. Every day became another promise of later. I'll be home soon. I'm sorry. Can we talk tomorrow? Tomorrow became another tomorrow. Felix never complained. That was his dangerous habit. Instead of arguing, he smiled. Instead of crying, he cooked dinner. Instead of asking to be loved, he convinced himself he could wait. He had always been that way. Ever since childhood, Felix feared becoming a burden. His parents had spent years struggling financially. He learned early that people already carried enough weight. So whenever he hurt, he stayed quiet. Whenever he felt abandoned, he apologized. Whenever he needed someone, he disappeared. Hyunjin loved that kindness. But he never realized kindness could become self-destruction. One evening, Felix prepared pasta exactly the way Hyunjin liked. Fresh basil, extra parmesan, a little black pepper. He even lit candles. The apartment smelled warm and comforting. 7 o'clock passed. 8, 9. At 10, Hyunjin finally texted. Sorry, emergency meeting, sleep without me. Felix stared at the message, then quietly blew out the candles. The smoke curled toward the ceiling. Dinner grew cold. He packed everything into containers and placed them inside the refrigerator. He smiled to himself. It's okay. No one heard him whisper it. Not even himself. Weeks continued slipping away. Hyunjin noticed Felix had become quieter. He assumed Felix was simply tired. He never noticed the untouched sketchbooks collecting dust. Felix used to draw every morning. Now his pencils remained exactly where he had left them weeks ago. He stopped playing guitar. Stopped humming while making breakfast. Stopped laughing at terrible jokes. Even his footsteps sounded lighter, as though he were trying not to exist too loudly. One rainy afternoon, Hyunjin found Felix asleep on the living room sofa. A blanket barely covered his shoulders. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His breathing seemed unusually shallow. Hyunjin gently brushed blonde strands away from Felix's forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Felix slowly opened his eyes. Instead of smiling, he looked confused, as though he had forgotten where he was. Then he forced a smile anyway. "You must be tired." Hyunjin kissed his forehead before leaving again. He never saw the tears rolling silently into Felix's hair after the door closed. Felix wasn't angry anymore. That frightened him, because anger meant hope. Silence meant surrender. Every morning he stood before the bathroom mirror. The reflection looking back felt unfamiliar. The bright boy everyone loved seemed to disappear little by little. Dark thoughts whispered endlessly. Maybe I'm asking for too much. Maybe love is supposed to hurt. Maybe I'm simply difficult to love. He hated those thoughts, but they kept returning, like waves refusing to stop. One evening he opened an old notebook. Inside, he found a sentence he had written years ago. "Never lose yourself while trying to keep someone else." He stared at it for several minutes, then quietly began crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for tears to stain the paper. Hyunjin loved Felix. There was never any doubt about that. But love without attention slowly becomes loneliness wearing familiar clothes. Hyunjin believed working harder today meant building a better future tomorrow. Felix only wanted someone to sit beside him tonight. Neither of them was wrong. Yet somehow, both were breaking. A week before Felix left, Hyunjin noticed something unusual. Felix had begun organizing everything. Books, clothes, kitchen cabinets, old photographs. He donated boxes of belongings without explanation. When Hyunjin asked why, Felix simply smiled. "I wanted to clean." Hyunjin believed him. He wanted to believe him. Ignoring warning signs felt easier than confronting them. Late that night, Felix stood alone on the apartment balcony. Rain cooled his face. City lights blurred behind tears. He placed one hand over his chest. His heartbeat felt distant, almost unfamiliar. "I still love him," he whispered into the darkness. His voice trembled. "But I don't know who I am anymore." For the first time, choosing himself felt more painful than sacrificing himself. Yet it was the only choice left. Some people leave because they stop loving. Others leave because loving has begun destroying them. Felix belonged to the second kind. He wasn't walking away from Hyunjin. He was trying to rescue the last fragile pieces of himself before they disappeared forever. And somewhere inside the apartment, Hyunjin continued answering emails beneath bright white lights. Completely unaware that the love of his life had already begun saying goodbye long before he packed a single suitcase, morning arrived without sunlight. Grey clouds hung low above the city, pressing against the skyline as if the sky itself had become too heavy to breathe. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows, leaving winding trails across the glass. Inside, everything remained painfully quiet. Felix woke before dawn. For several minutes, he simply lay still, staring at the ceiling. The familiar room no longer felt like home. Every object carried a memory. The bookshelf Hyunjin had insisted on assembling by himself, only to install every shelf upside down. The faded blanket they had bought during an unexpected road trip. The framed photograph from a summer afternoon when they laughed until their stomachs hurt because a seagull had stolen Hyunjin's sandwich. Beautiful memories. Memories that now hurt more than they comforted. Felix slowly sat up and rubbed his tired eyes. He had barely slept. Whenever exhaustion finally pulled him under, the same dream returned. He would reach for Hyunjin. Hyunjin would smile, then his face would slowly fade into a stranger's. Felix always woke before he could ask why. He walked quietly toward the kitchen. The floor felt cold beneath his bare feet. Instinctively, he reached for 2 coffee mugs. His fingers stopped. A faint, bittersweet smile appeared. Only one mug was needed. He placed the second one back into the cabinet with unusual care, as though afraid it might break simply from being touched. Outside, thunder rolled across the morning sky. Inside, silence answered. Several hours later, the apartment door opened. Hyunjin stepped inside, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of another exhausting rehearsal. His hair was damp from the rain and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Felix, no answer. He slipped off his shoes and walked farther inside. The apartment looked strangely organized. Everything seemed cleaner than usual, too clean. The dining table was empty except for a folded letter resting beside a neatly placed apartment key. Hyunjin frowned. His heartbeat quickened for reasons he couldn't explain. He picked up the envelope. His own name was written across the front in Felix's familiar handwriting. His fingers suddenly felt numb. Slowly, he unfolded the paper. The words blurred almost immediately, not because the handwriting was messy, because tears had already begun filling his eyes. Hyunjin, if you're reading this, I've already left. Please don't think this happened because I stopped loving you. That would be easier to understand, but it wouldn't be true. The truth is much harder. I still love you more than anyone. That's exactly why I have to leave. Hyunjin's breathing became uneven. He continued reading. Do you remember when you asked me what home meant? I told you it wasn't a place. It was a person. For years you were my home, but somewhere along the way, I became homeless inside myself. A tear landed on the paper, then another. Hyunjin wiped his face impatiently. No, his voice barely escaped his throat. The letter continued. You never intended to hurt me. I know that better than anyone. You were chasing dreams for both of us. You kept promising tomorrow. I kept pretending today didn't matter. Neither of us realized that love was quietly starving. Hyunjin pressed the paper against his forehead. Fragments of forgotten moments flooded back all at once. The untouched dinners, the empty smile, Felix falling asleep on the sofa before midnight, the sketchbooks covered in dust. The way Felix always answered, I'm okay, without being asked twice. He had seen everything. Yet somehow, he had seen nothing. His knees suddenly gave way. He collapsed onto the wooden floor, clutching the letter against his chest. The apartment echoed with quiet sobs he could no longer hold back. I'm sorry. The words sounded meaningless now. Across the city, Felix sat beside the window of a small train heading toward the coast. Rain blurred the passing buildings into streaks of grey and silver. He rested his forehead against the cool glass. His phone vibrated. Hyunjin. The screen glowed with his name. Felix stared at it until the ringing stopped. Seconds later, another call, then another, then another. 32 missed calls appeared before noon. Felix closed his eyes. His thumb hovered above the answer button. Every instinct inside him screamed to pick up, to hear Hyunjin's voice one more time, to say everything he had buried inside his heart, to turn back. Instead, he switched off the phone. The screen faded into darkness. His reflection appeared in the black glass. He barely recognized the young man staring back. His cheeks looked thinner. His smile had disappeared months ago. He whispered quietly to the reflection. If I answer now, his voice trembled. Go back. He knew himself too well. One apology from Hyunjin, one promise, one embrace. He would forgive everything, and nothing would truly change, because love alone could not heal what had slowly broken inside him. The train continued moving. Each kilometer carried him farther from the apartment, and farther from the life he had imagined they would grow old together. As evening settled over the coast, Felix arrived at a small seaside town where the air smelled of salt and wet pine trees. The waves crashed rhythmically against dark rocks below the cliffs. For the first time in months, he inhaled deeply. The air tasted different, lighter, yet the ache inside his chest remained. Freedom and heartbreak could exist at the same time. He was finally choosing himself. But every step away from Hyunjin still felt like leaving a piece of his own heart behind. Back in the empty apartment, Hyunjin sat surrounded by memories. He opened a drawer, searching for anything that still carried Felix's warmth. Instead, he found a small notebook hidden beneath a stack of magazines. Curious, he opened the first page. Every entry was dated. Every page was filled with Felix's thoughts. The earliest pages were bright, full of hope and excitement. Gradually, the handwriting became smaller. The sentences became shorter. The joy slowly disappeared. Hyunjin turned another page, then another. With every word, he realized the person he loved had been crying silently beside him for months. He had mistaken endurance for happiness. He had mistaken patience for strength, most painfully of all. He had mistaken presence for connection. Closing the notebook, Hyunjin looked toward the rain-soaked window. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, distant and blurred. For the first time since Felix walked into his life, the apartment no longer felt alive. It was only a place. Home had left. The sea woke before the town did. Long before the streets filled with footsteps and bicycle bells, waves rolled endlessly toward the rocky shore, breaking into white foam beneath a pale morning sky. The scent of salt drifted through the open window of the small guest house where Felix had spent his first night alone. He had forgotten how loud silence could be. No alarm from Hyunjin's phone, no sleepy complaints about waking up too early, no familiar voice asking, coffee first or breakfast first. Only the sea. Felix sat on the edge of the bed, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. He watched steam disappear into the cool air. Just as countless dreams had quietly disappeared over the past year, he reached for his notebook. For weeks, every blank page had frightened him. Drawing used to feel effortless. Now even holding a pencil felt unfamiliar. Still, he placed the graphite against the paper. His hand hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he began sketching the horizon outside the window. The lines were uneven, the waves imperfect. But for the first time in months, he did not erase them. He allowed them to exist exactly as they were. A quiet smile touched his lips. It was small, fragile, yet undeniably real. Back in Seoul, Hyunjin hadn't slept. The apartment lights had remained on throughout the entire night. Felix's notebook rested on the dining table, open to another page Hyunjin hadn't been strong enough to read before. His fingers trembled as he continued. Today Hyunjin laughed because I accidentally burned breakfast. I laughed too. I wish he had noticed that I hadn't slept for 3 nights. Another page. He hugged me before leaving today. I almost asked him not to go. Instead, I told him to work hard. Another. Sometimes I stand beside him while he's answering emails. I wonder if he can feel how badly I want him to look up. Hyunjin shut the notebook. His chest tightened until breathing became painful. Every sentence carried the same heartbreaking truth. Felix had never hidden his loneliness. He had simply expressed it quietly, too quietly. Hyunjin had mistaken silence for peace. Now he understood. Silence could also be a cry for help. His phone vibrated. It was Changbin. You didn't come to rehearsal. I know. You haven't answered anyone. I know. A long silence followed. Finally Changbin spoke softly. Is it Felix? Hyunjin closed his eyes. He's gone. The words felt impossible, as if saying them aloud made them more real. Changbin remained quiet for several seconds. Then he asked the question Hyunjin had been avoiding himself. What happened? Hyunjin looked around the apartment, at the empty sofa, the untouched coffee mug, the abandoned guitar leaning against the wall. I thought loving someone was enough. His voice cracked. I didn't realize they also needed my time. Meanwhile, Felix wandered through narrow streets overlooking the ocean. The town moved slowly. An elderly couple arranged flowers outside a tiny cafe. Children chased each other near the harbor. Fishermen greeted one another as if nothing in the world needed to be rushed. Everything felt strangely different from the endless pace he had left behind. A small art gallery caught his attention. Paintings filled the windows, landscapes, portraits, storms painted in deep blue and grey. Inside, an elderly woman looked up from arranging canvases. You draw, Felix blinked. How did you know? She smiled gently. Been staring at those sketches in the window like someone meeting an old friend. Felix laughed quietly. I used to draw. Don't know if I still can. Woman studied him for a moment, then handed him a blank sketchbook. Artists rarely stop being artists. They simply forget why they started. Felix looked down at the untouched pages. They smelled faintly of fresh paper and ink. Something warm stirred inside him, not certainty, not happiness, just possibility. That evening, Hyunjin entered the spare room they rarely used. Boxes lined one wall. Inside one of them lay dozens of Felix's paintings. He slowly unfolded the first canvas. It showed the two of them sitting beneath cherry blossoms. Hyunjin remembered that day. They had laughed because pink petals kept landing in Felix's hair. Another painting, their first apartment. Another, a rainy bus stop. Another, Hyunjin asleep on the sofa, completely unaware that Felix had painted him. Every painting carried incredible tenderness. Every brushstroke whispered the same thing. I loved you. Hyunjin reached the final canvas. Unlike the others, this one was unfinished. It showed a figure standing alone on a shoreline. Behind him stood another figure, close enough to touch, too far away to reach. There was no color on either face, only empty outlines waiting to be completed. A folded note rested behind the canvas. Hyunjin unfolded it carefully. I couldn't finish this painting. I no longer knew whether the distance between us was growing, or whether I had simply become invisible. Hyunjin pressed the note against his chest. Tears blurred the unfinished painting before him. For the first time, he understood that love does not disappear in a single moment. It fades through countless moments when one heart quietly waits while the other is too busy to notice. Outside, another evening rain began falling over the city. Far away, on the quiet coast, Felix stood barefoot where the waves met the sand. Cold water washed over his feet before retreating again. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of the ocean. It reminded him that even after every wave breaks, another one still finds the strength to return. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He still carried sorrow. He still missed Hyunjin with every heartbeat, but somewhere beneath the grief, a part of himself he thought had vanished forever had begun to breathe again.
The fifth morning by the sea arrived wrapped in silver mist. The horizon had almost disappeared, swallowed by low clouds that blurred the line between the ocean and the sky. The waves rolled in gently, carrying the scent of salt and wet stone through the quiet streets. Felix had begun waking before sunrise, not because he couldn't sleep anymore, because he wanted to watch the world slowly come back to life. He stood outside the guest house with a sketchbook tucked beneath his arm. The cold breeze brushed against his face, lifting strands of blonde hair that had grown slightly longer over the past few weeks. He found the same weathered bench overlooking the cliffs. The pages of the new sketchbook were no longer blank. Some contained unfinished landscapes. Others held quick drawings of seashells, old fishing boats, and children chasing gulls along the shore for the first time in a very long while. His hands no longer trembled when he drew. He still missed Hyunjin. That truth had not changed. Some evenings, without thinking, he still reached for his phone before remembering there would be no familiar message waiting. The ache remained. It simply no longer controlled every breath he took. As he shaded the outline of a lighthouse, a little girl stopped beside him. Did you draw all of these? Felix looked up and smiled. I did. They look lonely. The innocent observation caught him off guard. The little girl nodded, but not sad. Felix lowered his eyes toward the sketchbook. Not sad, the words lingered inside him long after she skipped away. Perhaps loneliness and healing could exist together. Hundreds of kilometers away, Hyunjin sat inside a dance studio that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Music thundered through the speakers, dancers moved in perfect synchronization. Mirrors reflected flawless choreography, yet Hyunjin couldn't focus. Every movement reminded him of someone who used to wait patiently until rehearsals ended. The instructor called for a break. Others laughed, drank water, and checked their phones. Hyunjin remained seated on the polished floor. Changbin quietly walked over and handed him a bottle of water. You haven't smiled once today. Hyunjin accepted it without drinking. I keep thinking. About Felix. Hyunjin nodded. I thought I knew everything about him. His voice was barely audible, but I only knew the parts he believed wouldn't trouble me. Changbin sat beside him. You loved him. I did. You still do. Hyunjin stared at his own reflection in the mirror. I loved him enough to dream about our future. He swallowed hard, but not well enough to notice he was disappearing in front of me. No one answered. Some realizations carried too much weight for comfort. That evening, Hyunjin returned to the apartment. The silence no longer shocked him. Instead, it settled over him like an old winter coat, heavy, familiar, impossible to ignore. As he searched through a cabinet for a notebook, something slipped from between two books and landed softly on the floor. A photograph. He picked it up. It had been taken years earlier during their first trip to the seaside. Felix was laughing so hard that his eyes had nearly disappeared. Hyunjin stood beside him with wind-blown hair and sand covering his shoes. Neither of them looked at the camera. They were looking at each other. The back of the photograph, written in Felix's neat handwriting, were a few simple words. If we ever lose our way, I hope the sea reminds us who we were. Hyunjin closed his eyes. The sea, he suddenly remembered. Whenever life became overwhelming, Felix always talked about returning to the ocean, not because it solved problems, because it helped him hear his own thoughts. Hyunjin looked down at the photograph once more. For the first time since Felix had left, he felt something other than regret. He felt direction. Meanwhile, the small coastal town prepared for sunset. The clouds slowly parted, allowing warm golden light to spill across the water. Felix walked barefoot along the shoreline. The tide curled around his ankles before slipping back into the sea. He stopped near a weathered lighthouse where dozens of colorful ribbons fluttered in the wind. An elderly fisherman nearby smiled. People tie ribbons there after letting go of something they carried for too long. Felix looked toward the ribbons dancing in the breeze. What if they aren't ready to let go? The old man adjusted his hat before answering. Then they don't, he smiled kindly. Letting go isn't the same as forgetting. Felix stood quietly. Those words settled gently inside his heart. He reached into his pocket and found a narrow strip of pale blue ribbon the owner of the guest house had given him days before. Slowly he tied it to the wooden railing. The ribbon fluttered wildly in the sea breeze. It carried no message. No name, no promise, only silent hope. Felix watched it dance beneath the fading light. I'll always be grateful, he whispered. His voice disappeared into the sound of the waves, not because his love had ended, but because gratitude hurt less than resentment. As darkness settled over the coast, he turned and walked back toward the town with steadier steps than before. For the first time since leaving, he wasn't walking away from his past. He was quietly walking toward a version of himself that had been waiting, patiently, to be found again. Autumn arrived quietly. The trees surrounding the coastal town had begun to trade their summer green for shades of amber and gold. Every afternoon, the wind carried fallen leaves across the narrow streets before sending them tumbling toward the sea. Nearly 2 months had passed. Time had not erased the pain. It had simply taught Felix how to carry it. Every morning followed the same gentle rhythm. He woke before sunrise, walked to the lighthouse with a cup of warm coffee, filled another page of his sketchbook, then spent the afternoon helping the elderly woman at the small art gallery greet visitors from different parts of the country. The gallery had become more than a workplace. It had become a place where no one expected him to smile before he was ready, where silence was never mistaken for rudeness, where healing wasn't rushed. One afternoon, the gallery owner approached him while he was arranging several paintings near the window. Someone bought your drawing. Felix looked up in surprise. My drawing, she nodded, handing him a small envelope. Lighthouse at sunrise. Felix stared at the empty space where his sketch had been hanging. For a moment he couldn't speak. Months ago he had believed he had lost every part of himself that made him who he was. Now a stranger had looked at something created by his own hands and decided it was worth taking home. A quiet warmth spread through his chest, not pride, not excitement, hope. It was unfamiliar, but it was there. In Seoul, Hyunjin stood alone inside the apartment. He had changed as well. The dining table was no longer buried beneath work schedules. His phone no longer remained in his hand during meals. He had stopped accepting every extra rehearsal and unnecessary meeting. At first, everyone assumed he was simply exhausted. Only Hyunjin knew the truth. He had spent years chasing a future while forgetting to live inside the present. Now every empty evening reminded him of the cost. One night he opened the kitchen cabinet. There, on the highest shelf, sat Felix's favorite ceramic mug. A tiny crack ran across one side. Felix had refused to throw it away. "It's imperfect," Felix had once said with a laugh, "so it feels more like me." Hyunjin carefully lifted the mug into his hands. His fingers traced the crack. He suddenly realized something that broke his heart all over again. Felix had never hidden his brokenness. He had quietly trusted Hyunjin to notice. The following weekend, Hyunjin visited Felix's parents. He hadn't gathered the courage before the familiar front door opened slowly. Felix's mother smiled gently, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "Hyunjin," he bowed deeply, "I'm sorry for coming without calling. You don't have to apologize." She invited him inside. The house smelled exactly as he remembered: fresh bread, lavender, warm tea. For a long while neither of them spoke. Finally Hyunjin looked down at his hands. "I failed him." Felix's mother remained silent. "I loved him. I know. His voice shook. "I didn't realize he was hurting." She poured another cup of tea before speaking softly. "When Felix was little," Hyunjin looked up, "he had a habit. If he broke something by accident, he would clean every piece before telling anyone." She smiled sadly. "He thought cleaning the mess would make people less disappointed." Hyunjin felt tears gathering again. He carried that habit into adulthood, tried to hide every broken piece of himself before anyone could see. She looked toward the garden outside the window. "But people who love him should have helped him pick up those pieces." Hyunjin lowered his head. "I wish I had." "So do I." Silence settled between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, only honest. Before Hyunjin left, Felix's mother handed him a small cardboard box. "He asked me to keep this years ago." Hyunjin accepted it carefully. Inside lay dozens of folded notes. Each one was dated. The earliest note read, "Today Hyunjin bought me hot chocolate because my hands were cold." Another, "He stayed awake until 3 in the morning helping me finish my drawing." Another, "He believes in me more than I believe in myself." Hyunjin smiled through tears. These notes came from the beginning, from the days when love felt light. Then he unfolded one of the final pages. "I hope one day he forgives himself." Hyunjin stopped breathing. "Not, I hope he comes after me. Not, I hope he suffers like I did. Only, I hope he forgives himself even after everything." Felix's last wish had never been revenge. It had always been healing for both of them. That same evening, far away on the coast, the art gallery hosted a small exhibition featuring local artists. Felix stood nervously near the entrance. His paintings hung beneath soft yellow lights. Visitors stopped, smiled, whispered to one another. One elderly couple stood in front of his newest painting for several minutes. The canvas showed two figures standing beside the sea. Unlike the unfinished painting he had left behind in Seoul, this one was different. The two figures were no longer reaching desperately toward one another. They stood apart, each facing the sunrise, each illuminated by the same warm light, not because they had stopped caring, because they had finally learned that love could exist without losing themselves. The elderly woman turned toward Felix. "This painting feels peaceful." Felix looked at the canvas. For a long moment he simply nodded. "It took me a long time to understand what it wanted to become." Outside, the evening sky slowly darkened as the first stars appeared above the quiet ocean. Felix stepped onto the gallery's porch and inhaled the cool sea air. The ache inside his heart still existed. Some wounds did not disappear. They became softer, less sharp, more like old scars than open cuts. He closed his eyes and listened to the waves. This time they no longer sounded like goodbye. They sounded like the beginning of someone finally learning how to live with both love and loss. Without allowing either to define the whole of who he was, winter announced itself with the first snowfall. Tiny white flakes drifted over the quiet coastal town, settling on rooftops, fishing boats, and the weathered lighthouse that had become Felix's favorite place. The sea was darker now, restless beneath a steel gray sky, yet it still carried the same steady rhythm that had slowly stitched together the torn pieces of his heart. Felix stood on the cliff with both hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. Snow landed on his hair before melting almost instantly. He smiled. Months ago, he would have instinctively reached for his phone to send Hyunjin a photograph of the first snow. "Say it's beautiful before I do," Hyunjin used to tease him. Today, Felix simply watched it alone. The memory no longer crushed him. It merely visited, gentle and quiet, before drifting away like another snowflake. He had learned that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering without falling apart. Later that afternoon, the gallery owner called him into the exhibition room. Several visitors were gathered around one particular painting. It was the lighthouse at dawn. Soft gold light spilled across the sea, while a lone figure stood facing the horizon. One visitor spoke softly. "This painting makes me feel hopeful." Another nodded. "It feels like someone survived something they can't explain." Felix lowered his gaze. Neither of them knew the story behind the canvas, yet somehow, they understood it anyway. Art had begun saying the things he could never find words for. When the visitors left, the gallery owner placed an envelope in his hands. "They've invited you." Felix looked confused. "Invited me?" She smiled warmly. "A national exhibition in Seoul." The words lingered in the air. Seoul, a city filled with memories. A city he had promised himself he wouldn't return to until he no longer feared it. His heartbeat quickened. He looked out toward the snowy sea. Perhaps healing wasn't measured by how far someone ran from the past. Perhaps it was measured by whether they could face it without losing themselves again. In Seoul, Hyunjin stood inside a small community art center. The room smelled faintly of paint and fresh wood. Children sat around long tables, laughing as they covered blank paper with bright colors. One little boy frowned at his drawing. "I ruined it." Hyunjin walked over and knelt beside him. He looked at the page. A splash of blue paint had spread across the corner. Instead of taking a new sheet, Hyunjin picked up a brush. If he dipped it into white paint, this becomes part of the sky. The little boy watched quietly. Within minutes, the accidental stain had become a drifting cloud. His eyes widened. It looks better now, Hyunjin smiled. Sometimes mistakes become part of the picture. As the child returned to painting, Hyunjin remained still for a moment. He realized he had unconsciously repeated something Felix once told him years ago. Erase every mistake. Sometimes they're what make the drawing feel alive. Hyunjin looked at the children, filling the room with laughter for the first time in months. He smiled without forcing it, not because the pain had disappeared, because he was finally allowing it to teach him instead of consume him. Several weeks later, Felix stood inside the train station. A ticket rested in his hand. Destination Seoul. Snow continued falling outside the enormous glass windows. He took a slow breath. His reflection looked different now. His shoulders were straighter. His eyes no longer carried the constant exhaustion that once shadowed every glance. There was still sadness, but there was also quiet confidence. The train began boarding. Felix stepped inside. As it pulled away from the coast, he watched the lighthouse slowly disappear into the snowy distance. He whispered a silent thank you, not to the town, not to the sea, the version of himself who had found the courage to leave before there was nothing left to save. Hours later, Seoul appeared beneath the winter sky. Nothing had changed, everything had changed. The streets remained crowded, the traffic still hummed endlessly, neon lights reflected across wet pavement just as they always had. Yet Felix walked through the city differently. He no longer searched every passing face for Hyunjin. He no longer expected every familiar street to reopen an old wound. He simply walked, present, steady, alive. The following morning, the National Exhibition opened its doors. Artists from across the country gathered inside the spacious gallery. Felix adjusted the frame of his largest painting one final time before stepping back. The title beneath it read, "Finding Home Within." Visitors gradually filled the hall. Some paused, some smiled, some stood in thoughtful silence before moving on. Felix remained near the back of the room, quietly watching strangers connect with pieces of a journey they would never fully know. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for someone else's approval. He had already found the one acceptance he had needed most, his own. Outside, snow continued falling softly over the city. Inside, surrounded by paintings born from both heartbreak and hope, Felix finally understood something he had spent so long searching for. Loving someone deeply had never been his mistake. Forgetting to love himself had been. Now, at last, both truths could exist together without tearing him apart.